The torch flames bent sideways in the cold wind, casting restless shadows across 50,000 sleeping men. No fortress walls protected them. No city gates stood between their throats and the darkness beyond. Just leather, wood stakes, and a trench barely deeper than a man's height separated the Roman army from tribes who wanted them dead. And yet, they slept. Every single night, in the heart of enemy territory, while their enemies watched from the forests, the Romans closed their eyes and rested as peacefully as if they were in their own beds back in Italia. How? The answer was not luck. It was not faith in the gods. It was something far more deliberate, far more brutal, and far more sophisticated than any other army in the ancient world had ever conceived. If you enjoy uncovering what history tried to hide, subscribe. Because what you're about to discover is not just a military tactic. It's a glimpse into the machine that conquered the known world, one night of sleep at a time. The preparation for sleep began hours before sunset, in a way that would seem obsessive to any other army. While the legionaries were still marching, their feet pounding the via in perfect rhythm, their shields strapped to their backs, a small group of men had already broken formation. These were the mensors, the military engineers, and they rode ahead on horseback with one singular purpose: to find the ground where 50,000 men would sleep that night. They were not looking for comfort, they were looking for geometry. The mensors carried surveying tools, groma for right angles, ropes marked at precise intervals, colored flags and wooden stakes. When they found suitable ground, flat enough, elevated enough with access to water but defensible, they began their work immediately. They laid out the camp in the exact same configuration it had been laid out the night before, and the night before that, and every night for the past 3 months. The Via Principalis always ran east to west. The Via Praetoria always ran north to south. The Principia, the command tent, always occupied the dead center. Every century knew exactly where their tents would be positioned relative to those axes. Every soldier knew, without asking, without searching, where he would sleep. This was not convenience. This was survival. By the time the first cohorts arrived at the campsite, exhausted from a 30-kilometer march with 40 kilograms of equipment strapped to their bodies, the layout was already marked. Stakes in the ground, flags fluttering in the wind, streets mapped out in dirt. The soldiers did not need to think. They did not need to argue about who got the best spot or which unit would sleep closest to the fires. The system had already decided, and the system was older than any man in that army. The first task was not rest, it was fortification. Before a single tent went up, before any soldier could even remove his armor, the perimeter had to be secured. Vegetius, writing centuries later, described the sequence with cold precision. First, the ditch, a trench 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep, carved into the earth around the entire rectangular perimeter of the camp. The dirt was not discarded. It was piled on the inside edge, forming a rampart. On top of that rampart went the pila muralia, sharpened wooden stakes that every legionary carried as part of his kit. The fortification was not symbolic. It was real. A trench that deep would break a cavalry charge. A rampart crowned with stakes would shred any infantry attempting to scale it in darkness. And it could be built by a trained legion in under 3 hours. Inside the perimeter, the camp began to take shape with mechanical efficiency. Tents rose in perfect rows. Streets remained clear between the tent lines, wide enough for rapid movement if the alarm sounded. Latrines were dug at the downwind corner of the camp, as far from the sleeping areas as the layout allowed. Cooking fires were lit only in designated zones, controlled, monitored, never left unattended. What had been an empty field at midday was now a fortified town by sunset. But the fortification was only half the system. The other half was far darker. The Roman army did not trust its men to stay awake on their own. It did not rely on discipline or fear of the enemy to keep guards alert. It built a structure of surveillance and punishment so brutal that falling asleep on watch was not a risk any sane man would take. The night was divided into 4 watches, the vigiliae, each lasting approximately 3 hours. Every soldier served 1 watch per night, 3 hours of guard duty, 6 hours of potential sleep. The watches rotated through the centuries so that no unit bore a disproportionate burden night after night. But the enforcement of those watches was where the Roman system revealed its true nature. The officer of the watch received a wooden tablet, the tessera, inscribed with the night's watchword. That tablet was passed from guard post to guard post throughout the camp, a circuit that took the entire watch to complete. At the end of each 3-hour period, the tablets were collected and inspected. If a post could not produce the correct tablet, if a guard had no explanation for why the watchword circuit had been broken, the investigation began immediately. And if a soldier was found asleep at his post, the punishment was not a reprimand. It was not extra duty. It was death. The method was called fustuarium. The convicted soldier was beaten to death with clubs by his own tentmates, his own century, the men who slept beside him every night. The entire unit participated. There was no trial by officer. The sentence was carried out by peers. The logic was simple, and it was collective. A sleeping guard endangered every life in the camp. If the perimeter failed, if an enemy force breached the ditch and rampart because one man closed his eyes, the entire army could be slaughtered in their tents. The punishment was collective because the risk was collective. Every man in the century understood that his survival depended on the man standing watch. And so, the men standing watch stayed awake. But not everyone in the camp slept the same way. The 8 soldiers of a contubernium, the smallest unit of the Roman military, shared a single tent. The contubernium was the atomic bond of the legion. These 8 men marched together, ate together, fought together, and slept within arm's reach of each other every single night. The tent they shared, the papilio, was a structure of brutal practicality. It was made from the hides of 10 calves, stitched together with waterproofed seams, treated with oil and tallow to resist rain. It weighed 40 kilograms. One soldier could not carry it. The weight was distributed among the contubernium, carried on a mule that traveled with each unit. The tent was heavy, but it was nearly indestructible. Canvas rots in prolonged rain. Leather, properly maintained, survives seasons of campaigning. The Romans did not choose leather for comfort. They chose it because it worked. Inside the tent, space was divided with the same precision that governed the camp layout. Equipment was stacked at the entrance: shields, peeler, swords, helmets, everything a soldier would need if the alarm sounded, within immediate reach. The rear section of the tent was the sleeping area. 8 men on straw-filled mattresses or animal hides, lying close enough that their body heat became a collective resource. In the northern campaigns, in Gaul, in Britannia, in Germania, where winter could kill as efficiently as any enemy, that body heat was the difference between survival and freezing to death before dawn. The centurion did not sleep with his men. His tent stood at the end of the sentry's line, separate, slightly larger, positioned so that he could observe his soldiers at all hours. The centurion's proximity was not a courtesy. It was a command structure designed to ensure that if anything went wrong in the night, if his section of the perimeter was breached, if his men failed, the centurion would answer for it personally. His authority extended into the darkness. If a soldier was making noise, if a tent was poorly secured, if anything disrupted the order of the camp, the centurion acted immediately. His vine stick, the vites, was not merely a symbol of rank. It was a tool he used freely on men who required correction, day or night. The senior officers, the legatus, the tribunes, the camp prefect, occupied the praetorium at the center of the camp. This was not a tent. It was a command structure, larger, partitioned, with separate sleeping quarters for the senior staff. The legatus had privacy. His officers had their own space. Documents, maps, pay chests, everything valuable was stored here under permanent guard. The praetorium never went fully dark. A lamp burned through every watch, and armed guards stood at its entrance at all hours. This was the nerve center of the camp. If the perimeter fell, this was the last position that would be defended. Most armies in the ancient world did not sleep this way. Medieval European forces on campaign, 1,000 years later, had no equivalent system. There was no standard camp layout, no fortified perimeter built every night, no organized watch rotation. Knights and nobles had tents. Common soldiers slept on the ground in their cloaks if they had them, often without shelter, exposed to weather and enemy raids. The camp perimeter, if it existed, was guarded haphazardly by men who had no systematic rotation, no enforceable punishment for falling asleep, no tessera system to verify their alertness. The consequences were predictable, and they were frequent. Medieval armies were regularly surprised at night. Camps were overrun, supply trains were burned. Entire forces were scattered before dawn because no one had thought to build a ditch or organize a watch. The Romans were almost never successfully attacked in their marching camps. The combination of the perimeter fortification, the watch system, the standardized layout that allowed rapid mobilization even in total darkness, and the brutal enforcement of alertness through fustuarium made the Roman camp a fortress that could be defended by a fraction of the force that would be needed to hold an equivalent position without those systems. Julius Caesar, writing about his campaigns in Gaul, described the speed with which his legions could construct a fortified camp. He noted with evident satisfaction that his men could have a complete defensive perimeter established faster than the Gallic tribes could organize a response. The camp was not just a place to sleep. It was a tactical weapon. A mobile fortress that moved with the army and was rebuilt from nothing every single night, regardless of terrain, weather, or proximity to hostile forces. When the Romans camped within sight of an enemy army, they did so behind fortifications. When they camped in a forest, in a valley, on a hillside, the same system applied. Ditch, rampart, stakes, tents, watch rotation, fustuarium. Every night, for months. For years if the campaign required it. The system did not fail, because it could not afford to fail. A Roman soldier who went to sleep in a marching camp knew several things with absolute certainty. He knew that the perimeter was fortified. He knew that men were watching that perimeter, and that those men would stay awake because the alternative was death by beating. He knew that if the alarm sounded, he could be armed and in formation within seconds because his equipment was stacked at the tent entrance, and the layout of the camp was identical to every other night. He knew where the Via Praetoria led, where the command center stood, where his sentry's position was in the defensive line. He did not need light. He did not need guidance. The system had made the camp legible even in total darkness. This was not luxury. This was not the army providing comfort to its soldiers out of kindness. This was force multiplication. An army that sleeps securely wakes up rested. An army that wakes up rested marches farther the next day. It fights harder. It makes better decisions under pressure. The Roman marching camp was a machine designed to extract maximum combat effectiveness from men who needed to campaign for months at a time, far from home, in hostile territory, against enemies who would kill them the moment they showed weakness. Every night of secure sleep was an investment in the next day's fighting capacity. That calculation was cold, and it was brutally effective. The evidence is in the results. The Roman army campaigned across 3 continents, in climates ranging from the Scottish Highlands to the deserts of Mesopotamia for over 4 centuries. Its soldiers marched 30 kilometers a day. They fought battles that lasted hours. They built roads, bridges, and fortifications while on campaign, and every single night they slept. Not because they were safe, but because the system made them safe enough. The leather tent, the ditch, the watch rotation, the tessera, the fustuarium, the standardized layout, the centurion's vites, the collective responsibility of the contubernium. Every element was designed to solve one problem. How do you keep 50,000 men alive and combat-ready in the middle of enemy territory, night after night, when the darkness itself is a weapon? The morning trumpet, the classicum, ended sleep with the same precision that had structured it. First signal, rise and prepare. Second signal, strike tents and pack equipment. Third signal, fall into marching formation. From the first trumpet to a moving column, a trained Roman legion could be ready to march in under 2 hours. The camp was dismantled as methodically as it had been built. Tents were rolled and loaded onto pack mules. Cooking fires were extinguished. The stakes were pulled from the rampart and returned to the soldiers' packs, ready to be driven into the ground again that evening. The perimeter ditch remained, too time-consuming to fill, but everything above ground was removed. The camp that had been a fortified town 12 hours earlier was reduced to an empty field with a rectangular trench by the time the vanguard began to march. Nothing was left behind. No supplies, no equipment, no trace of presence beyond the ditch itself, and even that would be invisible from a distance within days as rain and wind softened the edges. The Roman army moved, and it left almost nothing in its wake except the roads it built and the enemies it destroyed. But the night system, the sleep system, was not something the Romans advertised. It was not celebrated in triumphal arches. It was not the subject of epic poetry. Historians mentioned it in passing, as a logistical detail, something boring compared to the battles and the conquests. Vegetius wrote about it because he was writing a military manual, not a history meant to inspire. Caesar mentioned it because it gave him a tactical advantage he wanted recorded. But the soldiers themselves, the men who dug the ditches and stood the watches and slept in the leather tents, they left almost no written record. We know the system existed because the sources describe it. We know it worked because the Roman army kept winning. But we do not know what it felt like to be the man standing the third watch, 3 hours before dawn, in a forest in Germania, knowing that if he closed his eyes, his own brothers would beat him to death at sunrise. We do not know what it felt like to sleep with 7 other men in a leather tent, close enough to hear every breath, every shift in position, every whispered word. We do not know how many men died of exposure in those tents during the northern winters, or how many died from infections that started with minor wounds and festered in the close quarters. We do not know how many times the system failed, how many times a guard did fall asleep and the camp was not attacked, and no one ever knew. History records the system. It does not record the individual human cost of maintaining it night after night for years. What we do know is this: the Roman army's ability to campaign far from its supply lines, to sustain operations in hostile territory for extended periods, to move rapidly and strike decisively, depended on this system. Sleep was not a break from military discipline. It was an extension of it. The camp was not a refuge from war. It was war continued by other means, a nightly siege, where the Romans fortified their position, set their watches, and dared the enemy to try them. And the enemy, watching from the darkness beyond the ditch, seeing the fires, hearing the watch changing, knowing that the Romans were organized, armed, alert, and that any attack would have to cross a trench in the dark against men who were waiting for exactly that, usually chose not to try. The reputation of the Roman camp, the knowledge that it was fortified, that it was watched, that it would not fall easily, became its own defense. Enemies avoided attacking Roman camps, not because it was impossible, but because it was almost never worth the cost. The few times it was attempted, the results confirmed the wisdom of avoidance. The Roman camp held. The attackers died in the ditch or on the stakes, or in the narrow streets between the tents, where the legionaries, roused by the alarm, formed their lines and cut down anything that moved in the darkness. The system did not require brilliance. It required consistency. It required that every man, from the legatus to the lowest-ranking soldier in the newest recruited century, followed the same procedures every single night without deviation. It required that the mensors laid out the camp correctly, that the ditch was dug to the proper depth, that the stakes were sharpened and driven into the rampart at the correct intervals, that the watch rotation was followed, that the tessera made its circuit, that the centurion stayed alert, that the men of the contubernium trusted each other enough to sleep within arm's reach while one of them stood watch on the perimeter. It required that fustuarium remained a real threat, not an empty warning. It required that the morning trumpets sounded at the same time, that the tents came down in the same order, that the column formed and began marching before the enemy could capitalize on the vulnerability of breaking camp. Every element had to function. If one failed, the entire structure was weakened. If multiple failed, men died. The Romans understood this. The system was not imposed from above as a bureaucratic exercise. It was taught, drilled, and enforced because every veteran knew that it worked and that deviating from it invited disaster. There is something almost mechanical about the Roman approach to sleep, something that feels inhuman when viewed from the comfort of modernity. We think of sleep as rest, as escape, as the one part of the day where we are not performing, not working, not under observation. The Roman soldier had no such luxury. His sleep was scheduled, surveilled, and structured as tightly as his marching formation. He slept where the system told him to sleep, with the men the system assigned to his tent, under the watch of guards whose alertness was enforced by the threat of execution. He slept behind fortifications that he had built with his own hands after a full day of marching. He woke to a trumpet, not to his own internal rhythm. His rest was rationed, measured, allocated according to the needs of the campaign, not his own fatigue. And yet it worked. The Roman army did not suffer from mass exhaustion. It did not collapse from sleep deprivation. It marched 30 kilometers a day for months and remained combat effective because the system, for all its brutality, gave each man enough sleep to function. Modern militaries study the Roman marching camp because the problem it solved has not changed. Armies still need to sleep in hostile territory. Soldiers still need rest to remain effective. The tools have changed. Fortifications are built with bulldozers and prefabricated barriers instead of shovels and wooden stakes. Communication systems have replaced the tessera, but the underlying challenge is identical. How do you keep a large force safe, rested, and ready to fight when the enemy is nearby and the darkness offers no inherent protection? The Romans solved it with ditches, leather, and the threat of death for failure. The solution was not elegant. It was not humane. But it was effective. And it endured for longer than most empires have existed. The legacy of the Roman marching camp is not in the monuments or the literature. It is in the fact that the system works so well that it became invisible. We do not have dramatic stories of camps being overrun, because camps were almost never overrun. We do not have accounts of mass panic during night attacks, because night attacks on Roman camps were rare and usually failed. The absence of disaster is not exciting. It does not inspire poems or paintings, but it is the mark of a system that functioned exactly as intended. When the Roman Empire finally collapsed, when the legions were disbanded and the empire fragmented into successor states, the knowledge of how to build a marching camp did not immediately disappear. Vegetius wrote his manual in the 4th century AD, centuries after the classical legionary system had already begun to decline, specifically because he feared that knowledge was being lost. He was right. Within a few generations, European armies had no memory of the system. Medieval commanders did not lay out standardized camps. They did not dig perimeter ditches every night. They did not enforce watch rotations with the threat of fustuarium. The knowledge was gone, and it would not be systematically rebuilt until the early modern period, over 1,000 years later, when military theorists rediscovered Roman texts and began to understand what had been lost. The irony is that the thing the Romans did every single night, the thing that seemed so mundane that most historians barely mentioned it, was one of the key reasons they were able to sustain their empire for as long as they did. Armies that cannot sleep securely cannot campaign effectively. Armies that cannot campaign effectively cannot conquer and hold territory. The Roman marching camp was not a footnote to Roman military success. It was one of the foundations. So when you imagine a Roman legion on campaign, do not picture only the battles, the eagles, the formations, the triumphs. Picture the night. Picture 50,000 men behind a ditch and a rampart, sleeping in rows of leather tents, guarded by men who knew that falling asleep meant death. Picture the centurion walking his sentry's line in the darkness, vine stick in hand, checking that everything was in order. Picture the tessera making its circuit from post to post, the watchword whispered and confirmed, the system grinding forward through the night while the enemy watched from the forests and chose not to attack. Picture the trumpet at dawn, the camp dismantled in under 2 hours, the column forming and marching onward, leaving nothing behind but a ditch that would fill with rain and be forgotten within a season. That was the machine, not the battles. The nights between the battles. The system that allowed the battles to happen at all. And it worked because it was brutal, because it was consistent, and because every man in the army understood that his survival depended on the man standing watch while he slept. History remembers the victories. It forgets the ditches. But the ditches were dug every night, and the men slept, and the empire endured. Subscribe to uncover more of what history tried to bury.